It was a little sad to see that our comedy clip last week about Matt Walsh criticising Australia got tens of thousands of views, which is great. But our segment about the crime of medical malpractice against kids with gender distress only got a couple of thousand views. I really urge you to check that out. It may be one of the most important stories of our age and one of the greatest crimes of our civilization. The clip headline is Crime Against Kids, and it had this thumbnail. You can find it in the segments folder on our YouTube page with that thumbnail, or watch episode 314 on ADH TV, adh.tv. Basically, the story was about how in the UK last month there was an independent review of gender identity services for children. That review was commissioned by the Government Health Service over there, the NHS, and it was headed up by a retired paediatrician, a children's medical specialist named Hilary Cass. The review team found that the people in charge of devising the approach by which doctors handle kids with transgender issues was deeply flawed. Children with mental illness, for example, weren't getting proper psychological support, and endocrinologists, the hormone specialists administering the puberty blockers, didn't go to meetings with other specialists like psychologists or other doctors to refine treatments. They just operated as a law unto themselves. It shows that all the things that we've been told, like, oh, you know, these kids are getting the best psychological support, nobody has an incentive to push them into hormone treatment or puberty blockers, that was all nonsense. They weren't getting the right mix of support or any psychological support. They were subject to an approach called affirmation care.
Affirmation means if a girl comes along and says, I can't stand being a girl, I need to be a boy, you affirm that and agree. That's a totally inappropriate clinical stance. And Hilary Cass has underlined that many times, and that's an example of ideology, namely a kind of claimed human rights agenda, capturing what should have been a clinical domain.
Now that's Dr. David Bell. He used to be the governor at the NHS who had oversight of the main clinic in the UK, and he warned about all of this in his own report back in 2018.
The ordinary canons of clinical care, the need to maintain neutrality, the need to maintain a certain distance, the need to take a holistic approach and think of a child in the narrative of their life and their cultural and social links and their family. All that was abandoned.
As I said last week, I do believe some people have gender dysphoria, and it must be awful, but it's very, very rare. And it's a deeply complex issue that can't be solved by people with an ideology to push. And I just don't think that we can do these treatments on kids. The final Cass report included several systematic reviews of scientific literature carried out by the University of York. The report states, when the review started, the evidence base, particularly in relation to the use of puberty blockers and masculinizing or feminizing hormones, had already been shown to be weak. And after the examination of over 100 pieces of potential evidence, that there continues to be a lack of high quality evidence in this area. So NHS England has responded immediately, shutting down its main unit responsible for setting the clinical guidelines, and puberty suppressing hormones are no longer routinely available in NHS youth gender services. New patients who might be assessed as being suitable for them will be required to participate in a clinical trial that's being set up, and more research is going to be commissioned into the whole approach. But what is going on here in Australia, and what has been the response? One man who's passionately campaigned for the protection of young people from this medical overreach in Australia is regular commentator on the other side, Sean Masters. And Sean joins me now. Sean, thanks for your time. Tell us a little bit. I know every state and territory sort of got a different setup, but tell us basically what's been the Australian reaction to the Cass report so far.
Well, predictably, it's been disappointing. The Federal Health Minister, Mark Butler, stated that health protocols are different in Australia. And this is the same logically flawed sentiment that trans activist groups have all echoed, all essentially saying the same thing, that Australia is not the UK. So given that this is the universal feedback, it's important to unpick that statement and see how just untethered from reality it is. Firstly, the Cass report is an international study analysing 15 international clinics and 21 treatment guidelines around the world, not just the UK. The biggest review of its kind into trans health ever, 388 pages, 4 years in the making. And secondly, and dare I say more importantly, a so-called trans kid who is essentially just a troubled kid and most likely, statistically speaking, autistic, needs the same care no matter what country they're in. So for authorities to blithely say that Australia is not the UK makes no sense and is actually deeply irresponsible. And in fact, to prove that the Cass Review was an international report, Australia was singled out for special mention, specifically the Royal Melbourne Children's Hospital, led by Michelle Telfer, which scored an appalling 19 out of 100 on the correct protocols as outlined by the Cass Review. And the unfortunate thing is, it was the Royal Children's Hospital of Melbourne that was seen as the benchmark of setting trans care in Australia. So,
oh my God. Okay, so the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne got 19 out of 100 score on whether it was using the right protocol or not. And our governments are doing, I'm not surprised the Victorian government's doing absolutely nothing about it because the Victorian government is utterly useless. But the federal government is doing nothing about it either.
Well, exactly. So spinning out of that, you can ascertain that I think it's quite reasonable to say that Australian gender clinics have some of the most profoundly negligent, substandard care and malpractice in the world. And it's important to point out that, look, there will be criminal prosecutions in the future. Overseas, they've already begun. So, you know, I'd say clinicians really need to take note of what is happening around the world and to be on the right side of history. So, look, the National Association of Practicing Psychiatrists under Philip Morris has called for an urgent national review into puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So there are some positive signs, but on the flip side, you've got every single trans activist group and most government departments delegitimizing the Cass Review.
Okay, so we've got the trans groups here. We have the reaction from the trans lobby groups in Australia. So a joint statement from Equality Australia and the Australian Professional Association for Trans Health said that the Cass Review downplays the risk of denying treatment to young people with gender dysphoria and limits their options by placing restrictions on their access to care. Sean, I would have thought this increases their access to options.
Well, yeah, look, it certainly does, but I'll finish off on the most egregious response from one of our activist bodies here in Australia. A senior official of the Human Rights Commission, a guy called Kenton Miller, likened the Cass report to disinformation from a village idiot. Right? Which
that is utterly disgusting. That's the Human Rights Commission of Australia.
Yeah, I can barely believe I'm even saying that. He went on to say that the review is based on a very limited number of studies in the UK, which, as I've pointed out, is just not true. He said it's not legitimate, dangerous, full of disinformation. And once again, I'm going to say that lawsuits are coming. The point I keep wanting to come back to is that in the 80s, a Canadian psychologist by the name of Dr. Kenneth Zucker studied hundreds of trans kids, and he discovered that if left alone under the watchful waiting approach, 89% of so-called gender-confused kids turn out to be normal, happy, healthy, gay adults. The vast majority of the rest overcome their feelings of gender dysphoria through puberty naturally, and only 0.0183% go on to be trans as an adult. So what we're doing is we are sterilizing gay kids, and we are under a heteronormative stereotype ideology. We are turning gay kids trans and making them hetero. We're kind of fixing gay kids.
It's bizarre, isn't it? It's just the opposite of everything that we sort of, you thought in the 1980s. Unbelievable.
Activists and advocates of the affirmation approach, where you just need to immediately affirm whatever the confused child says, say they're on the right side of history, but they are not.
Well, mate, as you say, they need to be bloody careful because lawsuits and jail await. Sean, thanks very much for your time this morning. We really, this evening on the show, we really do appreciate it.
No problem.
If you like that content, there's a lot more where that came from. This is The Other Side, a show that comes out every Friday night that summarises all the news of the week without the woke, and we would love for you to subscribe and join us. As an Aussie show, your support means a lot to us, so please subscribe here or here and smash that little notification bell, and you can watch a full episode right here.